Jimmy Akin's Mysterious World is brought to you by the Star Quest Production Network and is made possible by our many generous patrons. If you'd like to support the podcast, please visit sqpn.com/give. You're listening to episode 315 of Jimmy Akin's Mysterious World, where we look at mysteries from the twin perspectives of faith and reason. I'm Dom Bettinelli, and I'm joined today, as always, by Jimmy Akin. Hey, Jimmy.
Howdy, Dom.
Folks, this is a special bonus episode that we previously recorded to thank our patrons at patreon.com/StarQuest for their generosity in making this and all our shows at StarQuest possible. We gave them early, exclusive access, but now we're sharing it with you to show you one of the benefits of being a patron. So please enjoy the show. All right. So let's get into it then right away. The first question, incidentally, is one I brought to you. It came from our Discord community, and it's this. If Frankenstein's monster from the Mary Shelley book was real, would it have a soul? And if so, would it have a new soul or the soul of one of the body parts donors? And which one?
Well, every living creature has a soul, so Frankenstein's monster would have a soul once it was animated. The problem is figuring out where that soul would have come from, and basically there are a few possibilities. One possibility is that the soul would come from one of the donors, and if that's the case, my guess would be it would be the brain donor. On the other hand, it's also possible that it could be a newly created soul, and since no one's made Frankenstein's monster yet, the church hasn't had occasion to figure out this question, and ultimately it'd be up to God. But if people started making Frankenstein's monsters in significant numbers, the church might have to weigh in on this and try to figure out exactly where the soul was coming from. But don't make Frankenstein's monsters. It's not moral.
That is a good point. Yes. All right. Our next question comes from Father Matthew, and he asks, Jimmy, have you ever heard of the Van Meter visitor, a supposed winged creature multiple people claim to have seen in Van Meter, Iowa in 1903? If so, what are your thoughts on the topic?
Well, I haven't researched the Van Meter visitor yet, but here's a summary from Wikipedia. It says, in September and October 1903, there were multiple instances of people claiming to have seen a winged, bat-like creature in and around Van Meter. The roughly 9-foot-tall being, which has since been dubbed the Van Meter visitor, was reported to be able to shoot light from the horn situated on its forehead and be unaffected by bullets. Clarence Dunn, one of the witnesses, had even made a plaster cast of 3-toed footprints it left behind. A smaller, similar being sometimes accompanied it. After a community-led confrontation, the being disappeared after about 4 days, supposedly into a nearby coal mine. Claims of witnessing bat-like creatures or phenomena have continued, including into the 2010s. Now, as always, one would want to look for conventional explanations first, like misidentifications. And something like this, winged, tall, thin, okay, that sounded kind of like a stork. So maybe it was a stork. But I'll look into it further, and we may have a future episode on it.
Excellent. Justin C. asks, ever heard of the 1973 Piedmont, Missouri UFO flap? It was a cluster of fairly well-documented sightings, but hasn't really gotten the attention of some of the more well-known sightings that you've covered or have been covered in other media. Could make for a cool show topic. I grew up there and could give you more info if you'd like. The town did a 50th anniversary celebration last year, which got some local publicity. Thanks for all the great work.
I know a little about the Piedmont UFO flap, but I haven't researched it in detail yet. I'll definitely consider it for a future episode, especially now that I'm back here in the Ozarks, which is also where Piedmont is. And if you have resources that you could recommend for researching it, do let us know. And that goes for folks generally. Anytime you're asking about a topic, if you're aware of resources that I could use to get good information about it, please let us know where those resources are, links, book titles, stuff like that.
And just Hallahan asks, can apologists use something like brain-computer interfaces, like Neuralink, to prove the soul and that the signals in our brain just correlate with ideas and aren't the ideas themselves?
A brain-computer interface would be able to monitor and interact with the reflection of our thoughts in the neurons that activate in our brains when we have them. So we've got a thought, and that's mirrored in some way in the neurons of our brains. But this, and then a brain-computer interface would allow us to monitor that mirroring going on. But it wouldn't tell us whether the brain generates consciousness or merely reflects consciousness that has another source. I thus wouldn't see brain-computer interfaces themselves as having an apologetic use, although the brain mapping that we've had so far and that we're still getting does contain clues that the brain does not generate consciousness. For information about that, you might want to check out Edward and Emily Kelly's book, Irreducible Mind, and its sequels, where they discuss the fact that we've found brain structures that do specific low-level functions, but we've never found brain structures that are responsible for higher-level functions, suggesting that the higher-level functions of thought may not be produced by the brain.
The next question comes from Aaron Vergeson, who asks, what if Adam...
He's got several questions.
Well, right. Actually, he does. I'm looking down the document. So first question is, what if Adam simply cut down the tree of forbidden fruit right after being told to not eat it? Or what if he grafted a branch of it onto another tree, then ate the fruit born from that graft?
Okay, so let's talk about cutting down the tree first. Adam was placed in the Garden of Eden in order to keep it and protect it. And in some extra biblical literature that we're going to be talking about soon on the show, it even talks about how Adam was put there to protect the trees of the garden from birds and from animals that might want to eat their fruit. Well, the Garden of Eden was essentially a pleasure garden for God, like a nobleman or a king might have, a nice, neat, natural setting to go wander through and relax in and stuff. And if God planted the tree of knowledge there, then he wanted the tree of knowledge there. And so if you're the gardener and you cut down one of the Lord's trees without the Lord's permission, Lord in the sense of owner of the property you're working on, your Lord's going to be honked off about that. So if Adam had cut down the tree of knowledge, then he would have gotten in trouble with God. On the other hand, what about grafting a branch from the tree of knowledge onto another tree? Well, that would be circumventing the clear intent of the owner. If you're, he's told you don't eat the fruit of this tree, he means don't eat this kind of fruit. And if you just transplant a branch of that fruit onto another tree and then eat it, you're still going to get in trouble with the owner. And so either way, on either of these options, I think Adam would have fallen, just in another way.
All right, Aaron's next question. Would it have been morally permissible for Elrond of the Lord of the Rings to throw Isildur into the fires of Mount Doom when he decided to not destroy the ring?
Well, if there was no other better way to spare the world from the destruction that the ring would cause, then yeah, you could chuck Isildur and the ring into Mount Doom. However, there are probably other better solutions, like yanking the ring off Isildur's finger and throwing it into the mountain. That would have been preferable. That way you still have Isildur, but you get rid of the ring. Also, Elrond, now you might have some trouble getting the ring off of Isildur's finger, but you could also just cut off his fingers. In fact, in the movie, that's the way Isildur himself got the ring, by cutting off Sauron's fingers. So it seems to me that while in extremis it would be possible to do this, you need to exhaust other better possibilities first.
All right. And another question from Aaron. What would be the moral ramifications on the hypothetical scenario of Jimmy Akin having 30 years of Catholic Answers Live answers compiled and used to create a robot Jimmy Akin where callers' answers are recorded answers, but it feels live like a human interaction?
Well, it wouldn't be it wouldn't be problematic in principle. Robot delivery of my prior answers would just be another way of presenting previous content that I've generated, like watching a video or listening to audio. I would just want the robot to avoid the uncanny valley for people. I wouldn't want it to be creepy. And I would want some of my old answers deleted from the database because I've improved over 30 years.
All right. And then the next one is another one from Aaron. He says, if the multiverse really exists, would it be prudent to change titles like Mary, Queen of the Universe to Mary, Queen of the Multiverse?
Well, if the multiverse exists, and that's a big if, we don't know enough about what happens in other universes to be sure that a change like that would be accurate. Also, if the multiverse exists and functions as it's commonly understood, then it would seem that there would be different versions of Mary in different universes, and each of them might be queen of their own universe. So you wouldn't want to declare one of these Marys queen of the whole multiverse. By the way, for folks who may be curious, we talked about the multiverse and the problems with claiming for a fact that it exists back in episode 25. So you can go to mysterious.fm/25 for that.
And I want to point out for folks that if you look in our podcast feed in various directories, you won't find 25 in there because only so many episodes fit in the feed. So definitely go to that link or go to mysterious.fm for a link that has a bunch of our earliest shows there as well.
All of our shows are there. It's just you may not find them in the primary feed. Yeah, but we have a secondary feed.
And patrons like you, we bundle them up and post them to Patreon, so you can actually get them all for free right there. Just download them in a bundle too. All right, our next question comes from Brian White, who asks, what is your understanding of the significance of the naked man fleeing from the Garden of Gethsemane in Mark 14:51-52? Do you have thoughts on why Mark chose to include this detail?
Well, I'll tell you a common theory that I don't think is true. The idea is that Mark himself is the man who ran away naked, because it says he was a young man, and we know Mark was young. And the idea has been that this is Mark putting himself kind of anonymously into his own gospel as a little cameo, kind of the same way that Alfred Hitchcock would have little cameos in his films. For example, I was just watching the 1955 film To Catch a Thief with Cary Grant and Grace Kelly. And there's a moment where Cary Grant gets on a bus and he's sitting on the back seat of the bus, and sitting right next to him is Alfred Hitchcock. And so that's Alfred Hitchcock's cameo for To Catch a Thief. Well, the thing is, I didn't have any Hitchcock movies in the first century. And so this was not an established custom. And really, if you track the history of this theory, it's only really been popular in very recent times. This has not been the historic understanding down through Christian history, which also is evidence that, this was not an established literary technique of putting yourself in your own work anonymously. There's also a problem with the idea that it would have been Mark, because Mark is still a young man in Acts chapter 12 when Peter is almost killed by Herod Agrippa, but then he gets let out of prison by an angel and he goes to the house of Mark's mother. And this is occurring in the year AD 43, which is 10 years after the crucifixion. So if Mark had been a young man in AD 33 who was out walking by himself at night, well, then he would have needed to be at least in his teens, and he would have been then, let's say 17, and then he would have been 27 at the time that Peter got let out of jail. But that just doesn't see, he's still described as a young man in Acts when he's introduced there. And so he seems to be too young to have been an eyewitness of the gospel, unless he was like 6. But then he wouldn't have been described as a young man, but as a child walking around by himself at night in the linen garment. And he's not described that way. And also, Mark is never presented as an eyewitness of Jesus's ministry. So I think that that there are multiple problems with this. So if you scrape off the idea that it's Mark and take a fresh look at the evidence, what might we conclude about this passage? Well, we have a figure who has something unusual happen to him that, he runs away. He gets out of his linen garment when they grab him, and he runs away naked. And so that's unusual and significant. But this figure is not named. So that resonates with other passages in the Synoptic Gospels where we have figures who are connected with Jesus and his movement and who do significant things, but who are not named. Like, for example, the woman who anoints Jesus is not named in the Synoptics, even though Jesus says what she's done is going to be told all over the world. Wherever this gospel is preached, you're going to tell about this woman. And they did, but they didn't tell us her name. And then there's, for the triumphal entry, Jesus says, go into this town and find this donkey and its colt tied out in front of a house, which is not where you would tie up donkeys. And take them, bring them back to me. And if anybody says to you, what are you doing? Tell them the Lord has need of these. So it's like, and then they'll let you take them. And so that's like a prearranged thing that Jesus is doing. And similarly, when they have the Last Supper, Jesus sends Peter and John into Jerusalem, and he says, find this guy who's carrying water on his head, which is normally woman's work, but find this guy who's carrying water on his head, follow him home, and then say to the householder, where is the furnished upper room for me and my disciples to have Passover, and you'll find one. And so they did. And this is some prearranged thing that's going on. And then in the Synoptics, it doesn't reveal who cut off the ear of the high priest's servant. Well, what you find when you go to John, the last of the Gospels to be written, is a bunch of these people get names. And so it looks like, I think this is a very plausible theory, that what the Synoptics are doing is they're giving protective anonymity to the people who were involved because they still lived in and around Jerusalem. And consequently, if you just named them, they could get in trouble with the authorities. Like whoever gave Jesus the colt for the triumphal entry, he was publicly declaring himself to be the Messiah by that entry. And so that could be considered a treasonous act. Similarly, the woman who anointed him, Messiah means anointed one. And so anointing him could also be understood as a treasonous act. And so it looks like the Synoptics, this is something that, among others, the British scholar Richard Bauckham has talked about. He's not the only one, but it looks like the Synoptics are hiding the names of the people who did these things because they were still living in and around Jerusalem and could have gotten in trouble if their names were known. But then in John, a bunch of them get names, apparently because they're either no longer living or they're no longer in Jerusalem. So they can't get in trouble with the Jerusalem authorities. Well, given that pattern of anonymity, I would propose, as have others, that the man who runs away naked is being given protective anonymity. He's somebody else that was known to the early Christian community. And the authorities have an interest in arresting him. He's not just an ordinary bystander who's just walking down the street looking at what's happening. They want to arrest him for some reason. So he's somebody important who is yet not one of the 12. So do we know anybody besides Jesus that the authorities were trying to arrest at this time who was not one of the 12? And the answer is yes, we do. Lazarus. Jesus had just raised Lazarus from the dead, and we're told that people were like believing in Jesus like crazy because of Lazarus. And John tells us that the authorities were trying to kill Lazarus too. So I think, while there's no way to be certain, I think the most plausible candidate based on the data we have is that the man who ran away naked was Lazarus. And Mark gives him protective anonymity because Lazarus was still living in Bethany right next to Jerusalem. And so I wrote an article about this a few years ago on my website, and we'll have a link to it so you can read more about it.
Very good. Our next couple questions come from Gemel87. The first one, aside from extraterrestrials, crypto-terrestrials, spiritual beings, etc., I've often heard you cite the possibility of people or creatures from other dimensions to explain certain mysteries. What evidence is there for other dimensions? Do we have any indication that they exist?
Well, we have evidence that at least one other dimension exists, and it's a spiritual one, heaven. Purgatory and hell also hypothetically could be additional dimensions, but I suspect that they're just aspects of a single spiritual world. When it comes to physical dimensions, well, string theorists in physics claim to have evidence for multiple other dimensions, but they're teensy tiny. Also, string theory has fallen on hard times, and I don't support it. Based on my present research, I'm not aware of solid evidence for other physical dimensions, though that could change as I do more research. In the meantime, I list interdimensional beings as a conceivable explanation for some of the mysteries we cover, even though I don't presently have solid evidence for their existence.
All right. And the second question, I would really like to hear Jimmy's response to this argument. I definitely agree that it's not always demons and that it's important to emphasize this point. Having said that, I do find Jimmy's assessment for demonic activity often a bit overly simple. I've heard Jimmy state repeatedly, if they're not feeding you bad theology or trying to get you to worship other gods, then I have no evidence for demonic activity. There may be no evidence, but demons are definitely capable of playing a long game and a subtle game, and extreme caution is paramount in some cases. Father Nathan Castle's ministry is an excellent example. Thoughts?
Well, feeding people false theology is one piece of evidence for the demonic, but it's not the only one. Seeking to harm people and showing an aversion to the holy also is. But we really need a cluster of different indicators. As the church's official text on exorcism indicates, one or two indicators isn't enough, as they can be exhibited by things other than demons. So you really need a complex of different pieces of evidence. I have no evidence of demons in Father Castle's ministry, but we should always be cautious in life. If you want to hear my assessment if you want to hear about Father Castle's ministry and my assessment of it, you should listen to episodes 269 and 270. So you can go to mysterious.fm/269 and mysterious.fm/270.
And our next question comes from a frequent contributor to various Star Quest shows, Thomas Salerno. And he writes, "Hi there, Jimmy. I'm world building for a science fiction story about an alternate future where humankind has colonized many solar systems. The Catholic Church is thriving in this scenario and has a presence on most planets that have a significant human population. In such a scenario with an interstellar church, how do you think the ecclesial organization and hierarchy would be adapted to these circumstances? Would a diocese/archdiocese span an entire planet or moon? Or would city-sized dioceses continue to exist under a new planet-wide jurisdiction, a kind of super archdiocese? What are your thoughts? Thanks in advance for your insight."
Well, this would partially depend on the ease of getting from one planet to another, including how quickly you could get from one planet to another, because the more isolated people are, the more you're going to need local ecclesial authorities. On the other hand, if it's as easy to get from one planet to another as, a 15-minute car trip today, well, then you might have one diocese that spans multiple planets. The goal probably would be to have at least one diocese or eparchy for each planet as soon as this is possible, assuming you can't just, get between them super quickly. you'd want at least one diocese per planet. Beyond that, new dioceses would be erected based on how many Catholics were present and in what locations on that planet. If you have, let's say, two continents and they both have sizable Catholic populations, then it would make sense to have two dioceses on this planet. And that's, the way they're erected here on Earth. We put the diocese, except for titular dioceses, which are another story. We put the active functional diocese where the Catholics are. So anytime you have a group of Catholics in an area and they get sizable enough, you tend to create a diocese there. And especially on planets or in stellar provinces that have multiple dioceses, it would be natural for some bishops to be given elevated titles like archbishop, patriarch, or cardinal. For an interest in, so you might have, for example, the archbishop of the Coalsack sector of space, and then all his subordinates in that stellar province would just be regular bishops. For an interest in science fiction look that touches on aspects of this, I'd suggest seeing Jerry Pournelle's Codominium universe. Two of the books in that I know touch at least briefly on ecclesiastical matters are The Mote in God's Eye and The Grip in Hand. He also has other books like King David's Spaceship, but I haven't, and Falkenberg's Legion and stuff like that, but I haven't read all those, so I don't know to what extent they touch on this.
Our next question comes from Carolyn Stem, who writes some timekeeping questions. Why are there 7 days in a week? By when would most people have been using a 7-day week? Also, when would most people have been able to tell you what year it was?
Okay, so there are 7 days in a week because 7 was a special number to the Hebrews. Why that is uncertain, but it may be that there are 7 days in a week because there are 7 classical planets that everyone can see in the sky. Those 7 planets are the Sun, the Moon, Mercury, Venus, Mars, Jupiter, and Saturn. So those are the ones that are visible to the naked eye. The reason the Sun and the Moon are classified as planets is because they, like the other planets, wander against the background of fixed stars. That's where we get the word planet. In Greek, it means planetes means wanderer. And so you have fixed lights in the sky, like the stars of the Big Dipper. Let's say those are fixed. They may rotate around the celestial pole, but relative to each other, they always stay in fixed positions. On the other hand, there are these 7 other bodies, including the Sun and the Moon, that wander against those background stars, and there's only 7 of them, and people noticed that. And so that's one plausible reason why 7 might have become a special number to the Hebrews. It's also a prime number, but I don't know that they thought in terms of prime numbers. We don't have records of ancient Hebrews being interested in prime numbers, but we do have evidence of ancient Near Eastern people, including the Israelites, being interested in what's going on in the sky. So even though it's speculative, that would be my guess, at least my best current guess, of why a Hebrew week is 7 days long. Other cultures also had units of time similar to weeks. For example, the Egyptians had a 10-day week, and various other groups had shorter or longer units like that. The 7-day week then started to spread among the nations with the Jewish diaspora. So like in the first century, Greeks and Romans knew of the concept of the week, even if they didn't use it themselves. It became very commonly used once Christianity became the state religion in the late 300s, because Christians also used the 7-day week, worshiping on the first day of the week, Sunday, instead of the 7th day of the week, Saturday or the Sabbath. So it was really, I would say, the Christianization of the empire that, so far as I'm aware, locked in the week in Western culture, the 7-day week. In terms of when most people would have been able to tell you what year it was, well, that would be all of recorded history, even if they didn't reckon years the way we do. They in the ancient world, they didn't have, for the most part, the kind of epoch that we do. We have the Christian epoch, BC and AD, and we relate all of our years to that. Well, they didn't have something like that in the ancient world, and they tended to use a number of different things as substitutes. The most common of these was what year a king was in. So you would say things like, oh, yeah, it's the 5th year of Pharaoh Imhotep, or it's the 3rd year of Alexander the Great, or whatever like that. And they'd reckon what year it was based on how long the local ruler had been ruling. So that was kind of the most common way of reckoning years, but it didn't suffice for all purposes, because sometimes you need to talk about time spans that are longer than the reign of an individual king. And so they started coming up with longer systems that are more like our epoch. For example, one that was very common, because people in the ancient world were huge fans of sports ball, just like people today are. And the biggest sports ball event in the ancient world was the Greek Olympics, which were held every 4 years. And so, and people from many different cultures, around the Mediterranean basin would come to participate in the Olympics. And so they started using the Olympics as a way of reckoning years independent of local rulers, because, everyone's going to have a different year because they have a different local ruler. But everybody who is interested in the Olympics, well, we can keep time with those. And so they did. And they would say things like, this event occurred in the 3rd year of the 41st Olympiad, or this event occurred in the 1st year of the 102nd Olympiad. And they kept time that way. Rome also had its own kind of epochal system. It was called, the abbreviation for it is AUC, which basically means like year of the founded city. And they would date events relative to when they thought Rome had been founded, which was like in the 750s BC. So they would say, oh yeah, it's today we're in the 651st year of the founded city, meaning we're 651 years after the legendary founding of Rome. In terms of when our own system came in, well, it sort of solidified a few centuries after Christ. One of the things that Christians had been doing was reckoning years from the time of the Emperor Domitian, but he was kind of a bad guy. And so is it Domitian or is it Diocletian? I may have my D emperors mixed up here. In any event, they had been using this, they had been reckoning Christian time based on this nasty emperor, and a monk named Dionysius Exiguus, or Dennis the Short, decided he didn't want to reckon time that way anymore. And he was tasked with calculating a table for the dates of Easter. And that means looking at different years and when Easter is going to fall. And rather than use this Roman emperor, he said, let's use a different D, Dominus, the Lord Jesus. And so he tried to calculate when the Lord Jesus was born. And his answer was 1 BC. Now, it looks like he missed it by a year or a year and a half. Jesus was probably born late 3 BC, maybe early 2 BC. But Dionysius was quite close, and his system caught on. And so by a few centuries, now he lived a few centuries after the time of Christ, but it was him that came up with the modern epochal system that Christians use. And it within a few centuries of Dionysius, educated, literate people were using his system and would have been able to tell you the AD BC year.
And people can hear the these different timekeeping periods in the Easter proclamation, right?
Mm-hmm.
I mean, that's,
yeah,
we get, in the something Olympiad, in the year of, the emperor and that sort of thing. So give that a listen next time, next Easter.
Next Easter.
Yeah. Jimmy Akin's Mysterious World is also brought to you by DeliverContacts.com, offering top brand contact lenses at always low prices with free delivery. Visit DeliverContacts.com. And by The Grady Group, a Catholic company bringing financial clarity to their clients across the United States, using safe money options to produce reasonable rates of return for their clients. Learn more at GradyGroupInc.com. All right, our next question comes from Melissa Lang, who writes, I recently read an article about the pyramids, and she helpfully included the link, though we'll put that in the show notes, theorizing that the surface shows water damage from a great flood, presumably Noah's. The author makes this sound like a new theory, but is it? And if so, what do you think of it?
Well, I haven't looked into this in detail, but ancient Egypt was, especially in the very early period when the pyramids were built, because those are like 4th or 5th dynasty. That's Old Kingdom. Egypt was wetter then than it is now. It's dried out over time. And Giza, where the pyramids are, the Great Pyramids, is directly opposite Cairo. And Cairo is down at the base of the Nile Delta, which is where the Nile River fans out as it goes north, as it flows north and approaches the Mediterranean Sea. Well, and Cairo is right where it starts to fan out. And so that's where the pyramids are. Cairo's on the east side of the Nile River. The pyramids are on the west side of the Nile River because since the sun sets in the west, that's the direction that the Egyptians associated with death. In fact, a dead person was called a Westerner. And so that they put their tombs on the west side of the Nile River. But here we're at the point where the Nile River is starting to fan out. And so that brings even more moisture to this area. The pyramids are also quite old. They're about 4,500 years old. And considering all that, I wouldn't find water damage impressive evidence of a global flood. They could easily suffer water damage from the fact that there was water there over that length of time, and you don't need to appeal to a big flood to explain it. A big flood also would be inconsistent with some of the other things that we found, like papyrus that would have just been destroyed. I mean, the reason that papyrus survives, and the reason that so much papyrus is found in Egypt, ancient writing on papyrus, is that it's so dry in the desert. And so once you get away from the Nile, there's not any moisture to destroy the papyrus, and it can survive the ages. Well, okay, if there had been a massive flood all over Egypt, we shouldn't find papyrus there from ancient times. It should have all been destroyed. So I think I'm skeptical of this argument. All
right. And our next question comes from Alex Silva, who writes, when I think of heaven as it exists today, filled with the angels and saints without physical bodies. How will the afterlife in heaven be different after the end of times, final judgment, and resurrection of our bodies? Will there be a completely new heaven, or will the saints be in the same heaven, but with their physical bodies? And what else will be different?
Well, Revelation doesn't describe the saints being with their bodies in heaven away from earth. Instead, the book of Revelation describes heaven and earth being united in the end, so that the dwelling place of God is with men on the new earth. So the biblical picture is that the saints will have their bodies, but here on the new earth. That then leads us to the question of, well, what's the nature of the newness of the new heaven and earth? And this could be understood in one of two ways, either as annihilation. So God could annihilate, meaning completely destroy, reduce to nothing the current earth and the current heaven, and then make a completely new heaven and a new earth. So annihilation followed by recreation. Or you could understand it in terms of renovation, that God's going to upgrade the heaven and the earth to make them new and perfect and so forth. And both the biblical data and the church's present conceptualization of how this works, for example, if you look in the Catechism, suggest that the renovation model, rather than the annihilation and recreation model, is what we should expect. So basically, expect a big upgrade, And then the saints will be living on the new earth with their resurrection bodies.
Renovation makes me think of the ultimate HGTV show. Shiplap everywhere.
Ultimate renovation, heaven and earth.
Extreme Makeover Heaven Edition. All right. Our next question comes from Colleen Rudolph, who asks, and this is a good question. I really, some of the best questions are the ones about the very basic things. Why do we scratch itches? It seems that no matter the cause of an itch, the first thing a doctor says is not to scratch it, as scratching leads to infection, spreading of the problem, etc. So if scratching an itch is so bad for us, why do we have such a strong instinct to do so, and why does it give relief?
Well, the purpose of itching is to get us to remove harmful things that can damage and irritate our skin, like parasites. You know, if you got a parasite, let's say you got a tick sucking on you, well, you want to get that off. Ticks, a tick is not going to take an appreciable amount of blood out of you, but ticks are harmful. They can carry diseases. And so what the itching does is it lets us know that there's something on our skin that we need to get off. Unfortunately, when we get a scratch, on our skin is already damaged. That's what the scratch is. It's a piece of damage. Just as if a parasite were biting us, there's damage there. And as a result, the scratch can irritate the same nerves that would alert us to a parasite and make us itch. And this is a case where our body's alarm system is being triggered by a different cause than what it was designed to react to. And so if you have a scratch on your skin, you shouldn't, and it's itching, you shouldn't scratch it, because it will harm the body in its effort to heal the scratch. On the other hand, there are other things that you can do damage to your skin by scratching on them, like if you have poison ivy and stuff like that. I don't know that poison ivy actually spreads when you scratch it, but you can make poison ivy worse by scratching on it. The fundamental purpose of the itch reflex is a good one. It alerts us to something we need to get off of our skin. But unfortunately, it gets triggered in other situations too, where we shouldn't be scratching.
All right. Justin Weller writes, I've heard it said you can't truly love something you rely on for life, i.e. air, water, food, since you depend on it, and without it, you would die. How does this work with our need for our Lord to create us and sustain our lives? Can we truly love him, since without him, we cannot exist?
Well, first, I don't know who told you that you can't love something you rely on for life. People commonly say that they love different types of food, and if they're starving, they'll love any food. Similarly, a thirsty person loves water, and if you've ever held your breath for too long, you love a good breath of air when you finally get one. So I'm inclined to reject the premise of this argument. Furthermore, I would point out that all the things that were just named, like air, food, and water, are things, not persons. And I think the principle that you can't love what you depend on applies even less to personal things like God, because you can definitely love persons, including those you depend on for life. Even small children love their parents, even though it was their parents who gave them life and who give them the care they need to remain alive. So if you can love your parents who you depend on for life, you can love God who you depend on for life. I think the premise is just fundamentally flawed.
Our next question comes from Cody Byers, who asks, what are your thoughts on the Loveland Frogman?
Well, this one we actually have a pretty good answer for. The Loveland Frogman was sighted in 1972 in Loveland, Ohio, by a police officer at night. He said it, looked like a frog or something about 3 or 4 feet long. And it turns out we got it, because later another officer saw it too and shot it. So we have the body, or did at that time anyway. And it turns out that it was a large tailless iguana that was like 3 or 3.5 feet long. And the officer who saw it was later talking to an author of a book about mysteries, and the author played up the mystery of the initial sighting, but did not include in the book the resolution that the other officer found. So it was a little bit duplicitous to omit the fact that, it turned out to be a 3-foot long iguana. But it appears that's what it was, and we'll have a link to an article where you can read about it.
All right. The next question comes from Hot Glue Gunslinger, who asks, my weird question is about plenary indulgences. My specific question is about the Kevin Smith movie Dogma. The plot's pretty basic. 2 angels are banished from heaven by a command from God and forced to live on earth for eternity, specifically Wisconsin. They're never again allowed to return to heaven. However, one of the angels discovers a loophole. The Catholic Church is offering a 1-day plenary indulgence situation that says that anyone who enters the doors of the church will be forgiven for all their sins and sanctified, as if they had just been baptized.
Yeah, that's not how indulgences work, but okay.
Yeah. If that person were to die afterwards, they would go immediately to heaven. And since the pact regarding the Pope says that anything the Pope holds true on earth, God shall hold true in heaven, so now we have a paradox. If these angels were to enter the church and receive plenary indulgence, they would be allowed back into heaven, which is a direct conflict from the actual word of God who banished them in the first place. The angels would renounce their angelic form and become human and then walk through the church doors. According to the movie, all manner of chaos would ensue and the world as we know it would come to an end. So, Jimmy, go for it.
Okay, well, first off, that's not how indulgences work. They don't forgive sins. They presuppose that the sin has already been forgiven. Furthermore, popes have no authority over angels, only humans. The angels also can't transubstantiate themselves to become human. They would cease to exist as themselves if they tried to do that. Even if it were possible to convert the spiritual substance of an angel into the spiritual physical substance of a human, the angel wouldn't be the same individual afterwards. I mean, think about it. Jimmy Akin is intrinsically human, but if you took the matter from my body and mashed it up and rearranged it and made an animal, let's say a rabbit, out of it, that rabbit is not Jimmy Akin. Jimmy Akin died when you mashed up his body, and the rabbit is, even if you get a living rabbit out of the other end of this process, that's a different individual. So you can't transubstantiate an angel into a human, and therefore their plan won't work.
To quote Han Solo, that's not how the Force works. So our next question comes from Adam.
Where did Han Solo say that?
In The Force Awakens.
Oh,
he said that to
one of those movies.
One of the sequel movies, yes.
Mm-hmm.
The next question comes from Adam Gettelfinger, who says, Jimmy, what's your take on the fable of the Spanish gold cache allegedly stolen by the U.S. government, or Lyndon Johnson, depending on the storyteller, from White Sands Missile Range? It's a fantastic tale with hallmarks of a thrilling urban legend, but the reports of corroboration from unrelated sources add an air of credence. The story looks like it was most popular from 1937 to 1993 and has since faded into obscurity.
Well, so this is known as the Victorio Peak treasure, and I've heard about this story in the past. I remember watching an episode of Unsolved Mysteries back in the day that had a segment on it. I remember watching it with my wife, but I haven't researched it yet. And we may have a future episode on it. I've thought about it and I've got it on the list. It may turn out to be real, but I think the burden of proof will be on establishing that the story is true.
And Cherry Birch asks, have you ever heard of the theory that the descriptions of angels in the Bible are actually peacocks, such as they have spots on their fan-like tails that look like eyes, hence the descriptions of wheels with many eyes? Were peacocks even native to the ancient Near East, or could they have been brought by traders?
Well, there are a couple of passages in some English translations that speak of Solomon importing peacocks from overseas traders. However, the identity of this animal is not certain because other translations say that they were actually baboons that he was importing. The passage you're thinking of where you have kind of wheel-like spiritual things that have eyes on them is Ezekiel 1. And the word that's used for these things is ophanim, which means wheels. It's unlikely that those are peacocks. So in the first place, the word that is used for them, ophanim, specifically refers to the wheels of a vehicle, not to a circle in general. So that's what Ezekiel was perceiving these things as, wheels of a vehicle. And a peacock does not look like a wheel of a vehicle. Also, Ezekiel says that it's the rims of the wheels that have the eyes on them. But that's not the way that peacock's tails are structured. When a peacock fans out its tail, it's got eye-like structures on the rim, but it's got them all over the place in the middle as well. And what Ezekiel saw was wheels that had eyes on the rims. Furthermore, the ophanim are said to house the spirits of the cherubim, and that makes them mystical creatures, not earthly creatures. The cherubim, in turn, are associated with God's throne, where they appear to function as throne guardians, with the ophanim possibly being understood as the four wheels of God's throne, the wheeled thrones being a thing in the ancient world. In any event, I think it's unlikely that the ophanim are peacocks or were even inspired by peacocks, but we'll be discussing them more in a future episode on angels.
Nicole Haygood asks, did Neanderthals, Denisovans, etc., those before Adam and Eve or first humans, have souls? If so, did they need salvation? And if they needed salvation to have eternal life in heaven, how did they obtain it? Since the fall happened with Homo sapiens, did they even have separation from God, considering they lived before the fall even occurred?
Well, okay, once again, all living creatures have souls. That's just that's the basic fact. All living creatures have souls. They have different types of souls, but they all have souls. So human relatives like the Neanderthals and the Denisovans definitely had souls. And since they were very close to modern Homo sapiens, their souls would have been very similar to the souls of modern Homo sapiens. It's unclear whether they would need salvation. It's also unclear that they lived before the author of Genesis envisions when Adam and Eve lived. I think and I've talked about this somewhat before, but I think we need to avoid trying to map the biblical image of man onto specific biological categories. You know, we are Homo sapiens, or sometimes people will say Homo sapiens sapiens, as opposed to Homo sapiens neanderthalensis or something. And that's our biological kind. But we don't know what the author of Genesis would have considered human. Yeah, he would have at least included Homo sapiens, but I suspect that if you introduced the author of Genesis to a Neanderthal or a Denisovan, that he may well have said, oh yeah, they're human, in which case they would be part of biblical man. And so biblical man would exist not just in Homo sapiens on this understanding of things, but it would exist in Neanderthals and Denisovans. They would also be man in the biblical sense of the term, in which case they would have fallen as part of our race, and they would be redeemed as part of our race. If on the other, so they would just be other humans, you know, they wouldn't need any special provisions. They'd just be just like us. On the other hand, if they are not to be counted as biblical humans, if the author of Genesis would have met one and said, yeah, that's not a human, then we don't know anything about their need for redemption or their lack of need for redemption. However, if it's correctly reported that Neanderthals buried their dead, and especially if they buried their dead with grave goods, then that would be archaeological evidence that they believed in an afterlife. And I think if you believe in an afterlife, you've definitely got one. I do plan to talk more about Neanderthals and other human relatives in future episodes after I've had the chance to do more research on them. So I hope you can look forward to that.
All right. Julia Wade asks, is there any evidence that Thomas actually touched the wounds of Christ? He's often referred to as having done it to believe Christ was there, but it doesn't seem to say that in a normal biblical translation. He claims to want to, and then sees Jesus and says, "My Lord and my God," I feel like if it was me, I'd apologize and say I was good and didn't need more proof of his resurrection.
Yeah, I don't think we can settle this with 100% certainty one way or the other. But Jesus told him to touch him. And so, even if he may have been uncomfortable and even humiliated, I think it's reasonable to infer that he touched him, but I also can understand the alternative point of view. So I don't think we can really settle this one 100%.
All right. Bridget asks, what are your thoughts on the legendary ghost ship, the Flying Dutchman?
Well, I know a little bit about the Flying Dutchman. I haven't researched it in detail yet, but I would doubt versions of the Flying Dutchman that portray it as being a physical ship that still sails. I don't think that would be accurate. I would be open to the possibility of it being a ghostly manifestation or haunting or a time slip, but I'd need evidence for any of these possibilities. And like I said, I haven't researched it yet, so I'm open-minded.
Cyprian Kazadaban.
Dude, almost everyone that's going to be Cyprian. But
I know. I get so stuck in the ancient languages. Cyprian Casadaban asks, my question concerns Matthew's infancy narrative. We can easily understand that Luke probably got most of his information about the events surrounding Jesus' birth from Mary, since they often involve her, although you've mentioned before that info could have come from Jesus himself or one of his relatives. What has always puzzled me is where all the information about Joseph's experiences came from, which are mentioned in Matthew's gospel, because it was written so long after Joseph's passing. I guess they could also have come from Mary, but they seem to focus so much on Joseph that it seems like they may have come from some other source. I'd love to hear your thoughts on this, Jimmy.
Well, so the experiences that Joseph has in Matthew's infancy narrative incorporate subjective material, like what he had in a dream. And the only source for that is going to be Joseph himself. But I don't think that the information was given to Matthew directly from Joseph, because Joseph was apparently dead before Jesus's ministry began. That's why Jesus entrusts his mother Mary to the care of the beloved disciple in John, instead of just sending her home to be with her husband. So Joseph's apparently dead by that point, and this is before Matthew was written. So the information in Matthew's infancy narrative must have come from Joseph through a chain of tradents being people who pass on tradition. And I think, by the way, that now I happen to think that Matthew wrote after Luke, and that when one of the signs of that is Luke focuses so much on Mary in his infancy narrative. And it's clear Mary is one of his sources, either directly or through a short chain of tradition. But it's clear Mary herself is the source of Luke's infancy narrative. I think Matthew felt that was unsuitable to focus so much on Mary for an audience of Jewish Christians. And so he wanted to balance the scales by focusing on Joseph. And that's why we get so much about Joseph and comparatively little about Mary in Matthew's infancy narrative. He wanted to balance things. So if we think about who the tradents could have been that passed on the information to Matthew, it's possible that Jesus himself was the tradent. He may have told Matthew about what happened to his father when he was born. It's also possible that it was another member of Jesus's family, such as his so-called brother James, or it could have been other family members. But it almost certainly would have been, someone connected with the family, if not a member of the family, but at least connected with the family, who passed on this information.
All right. Tim Harden asks, what do you think was so appealing about Canaanite religious worship that made it so tempting to the Israelites? It sounds grim, child sacrifice. I've never seen any resources that explained the appeal.
Well, child sacrifice is horrific to us, but we're not all barbarians, and it wasn't horrific to everyone, or it would have never happened in history. I think that in terms of what attracted some Israelites, it was a general cultural pressure to fit in with others, to be like their neighbors, the Canaanites, coupled with bad catechesis concerning the need to be loyal to the God of Israel, and a desire to get what they could from the gods that were recognized by their neighbors as watching over the land of Canaan. So it was a combination of desire to fit in with others and self-interest and bad catechesis and having an abominable moral sense.
That sounds familiar. So moving on to our next question from Scott Shields, who asks, if aliens are actually visiting Earth, why do you think they're coming here?
Well, there are numerous possible reasons. A few of them that are plausible include that they're here to do scientific research. Another one that is plausible is a desire to check out and monitor an up-and-coming competitor race, namely us. The notable uptick of UFO reports that happened after we detonated the first nukes would suggest that, as would the reported interest that UFOs have taken in nuclear weapon systems, like we discussed in episode 285 on the Big Sur UFO incident, where they reportedly destroyed a nuclear weapons delivery system while it was in flight. And you can go to mysterious.fm/285 to hear about that.
And now Mike M. asks, hi, Jimmy. Some people are adamant that diet soda is responsible for any number of serious ailments. I've noticed you sipping a diet beverage on occasion. Are they relatively harmless in moderation or an early death sentence? Thanks.
Well, as Philippus Areolus Theophrastus Bombastus von Hohenheim said, he's better known as Paracelsus, the poison is the dose. The poison is the dose. Everything, including water and oxygen, is dangerous or even deadly if you get too much of it. You can die from water intoxication if you drink too much water too fast. On the other hand, everything is safe in moderation. It's just a question of what counts as moderation. If diet drinks were super dangerous, well, that would be obvious by now because they've been in use for 50 years, and we'd see people dropping dead from diet drinks at unusually young ages who have no other comorbidities to explain them. Now, there have been some recent claims that they are associated with things like weight gain and diabetes, but as far as I've been able to determine, none of these are high-quality studies. They're just observational, and they don't dig into the causality of what's producing these effects. In other words, they don't take into account the fact that the very people most likely to use diet drinks are already obese and prone to diabetes. So it wouldn't be unexpected to find, people who drink diet drinks have more obesity and diabetes. Well, that's why they're drinking the diet drinks. As they say in science, correlation is not causation. To show that diet drinks cause such health problems, you need to do randomized controlled trials on people who aren't already struggling with weight or diabetes or things like that. You'd also need to test each non-sugar sweetener separately because different sweeteners have different effects on people. Now, having said that, some sweeteners might affect some people in a negative way. Years ago, when I was carrying a lot more weight than I am now, I experienced some negative effects like a race in pound and heart when I drank a lot of sodas sweetened with aspartame. When I cut out the aspartame and switched to diet colas sweetened with sucralose, the problem went away. I suspect that the problem was happening because aspartame degenerates into several substances, including phenylalanine. Phenylalanine in sufficient quantity will cause things like anxiety, which can drive up your heart rate and give you a pound and heart. Now that I've lost the excess weight, I don't suffer from that effect. And I do sometimes drink aspartame, but in lower amounts. I've also, as a favor to my doctor, primarily switched to drinking diet sodas that are sweetened with stevia, which, like this one, Zevia. And stevia is it's a different sweetener, and it happens to be a natural one. It's derived from a plant that's native to South America. though I don't consider the fact it's natural automatically makes it healthier. Belladonna, or deadly nightshade, is also natural, but it's one of the most toxic plants known. What I can report is that I do drink a lot of diet sodas, mostly sweetened with stevia. I'm not gaining weight. My blood sugar is normal, and my blood work, which is typically done every 3 months, looks good. So I don't have a reason to be super suspicious of diet sodas taken in moderation, but it'll depend on who you are and how your body reacts. Like I mentioned, how my body used to react to aspartame.
Very good. And those are all of the patron questions we have today. We hope you've enjoyed this Patron's Question show. Jimmy Akin's Mysterious World is only possible because of the generosity of our patrons on Patreon. If you'd like to support Jimmy Akin's Mysterious World and have your questions answered on future shows for patrons, please go to sqpn.com/give. And again, you can find links to Jimmy's resources from our discussion on our show notes at mysterious.fm/315. Jimmy Akin's Mysterious World is also brought to you by Great Lakes Customs Law, helping importers and individuals with seizures, penalties, and compliance with U.S. customs matters throughout the United States. Visit GreatLakesCustomsLaw.com. And by Rosary Army, featuring award-winning Catholic podcasts, rosary resources, videos, and the School of Mary online community, prayer, and learning platform. Learn how to make them, pray them, and give them away while growing in your faith at rosaryarmy.com and schoolofmary.com. And so that's it from us. We would love to hear your theories about any of the patron questions that Jimmy answered. You can let us know by visiting sqpn.com or the Jimmy Akin's Mysterious World Facebook page, sending us an email to feedback@mysterious.fm, sending a tweet to @mys_world, in the StarQuest Discord community at sqpn.com/discord, or calling our mysterious feedback line at 619-738-4515. That's 619-738-4515.
And I want to say a special word of thanks to Oasis Studio 7 for the video and animation work they did on this episode. You can check out their work by going to my YouTube channel, youtube.com/Jimmy Akin. And while you're there, please like the videos and comment on the videos, because that tells YouTube that you were engaged by them and that other people will find them engaging, so it'll show them to more people, and you can help the channel grow that way. Also, I am trying to grow the channel, and I'd really appreciate it if you subscribe and hit the bell notification so that you always get notified when I have a video. Usually these days, I have multiple videos coming out each week, and I really appreciate it, and thanks.
So, Jimmy, what's our next episode going to be about?
Well, years ago, like 10 years ago, I did a short 10-minute video about unicorns and the Bible. Recently, I thought, that would make a good subject for Mysterious World. I thought I'll expand it a little bit, and so I started doing research, and wow, was there a lot more to say. So we're going to be doing a 2-part look at unicorns. Next week, we're going to look at the historical accounts of unicorns, and then the week after that, we're going to go into analysis mode and show you what is responsible for the different kinds of unicorns that have been reported and the stories about them. And it's going to be surprising. It's not going to be one simple, easy, predictable thing.
Excellent. Very good.
But I will spoil this. Unicorns are real.
And every little girl just squeed. So until next time, Jimmy Akin, thank you for exploring with us our mysterious world.
Thanks, Tom.
And once again, I'm Dom Bettinelli. Thank you for listening to Jimmy Akin's Mysterious World on StarQuest.